Good afternoon. Thanks for persevering with the lines to get in the building, and really appreciate you being here, and to the members of Congress who are going to be here as well, speaking about this important topic, and with Stephen Cull in the University of Maryland's program for public consultation, and all the Fair Vote staff who has really worked so hard on this, particularly Rich Robinson, who actually has a nice history of working with Stephen before coming here. Today we're going to be talking about a fascinating and important public opinion survey of the three major components of the Fair Representation Act, which is HR 3057, which we'll hear a lot about Stephen's approach to this, but each pillar was looked at separately. So we have good findings to hear from about how citizens' commissions are seen by voters after they hear more about them, about ranked choice voting, and about the idea of multi-member districts, having more than one person represent you. What they tell us collectively are that voters are very ready to look to major changes, and it makes a lot of sense given what's going on with our politics. And I think that conversation is not a fleeting one. The challenges that our politics are facing are deeply baked into the rules we have, and we think that the solutions that we're talking about today are ones that an inescapable conversation ultimately has to happen. While they are new to many people across the United States, what's interesting is there's this real readiness to be, at the very least, interested, and a lot of people supportive. They're also not so new, too, and so we're not going to do like tutorials on each of these ideas as we go through this. So just the very quick thumbnail that sort of ties into this history is that ranked choice voting was developed by an American back in the 1870s. It has a long history of use. It has been used, it's used by millions and millions of voters overseas, but actually by a lot of voters in the United States. So Maine is scheduled to use it for its primary elections for governor and U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and state legislature in June. We're up to 13 cities that use ranked choice voting. We've had a whole string of interesting ones, and we'll hear from Maria Perez today about how it just worked in Santa Fe. Redistricting commissions are something that we're seeing in place in a number of states now, and the conversation about extending them keeps continuing. And we've seen that they work, and they're the international norm, and now we're seeing them used more and more in the United States. Multi-winner districts, this idea of having more than one representative, can seem new to people, but in fact it's actually part of many of our sort of electoral experience. Most localities have multi-member districts. As recently as the 1950s, 40 states had state legislative chambers with multi-member districts, and they were used for U.S. House elections in some states as recently as the 1960s. So we're not talking about something that's foreign, even if it sounds new, and we're talking about something that together make this powerful reform package. So we're going to be hearing from members of Congress, and we have three here. Congressman Don Beyer from Virginia, my congressman, Jamie Raskin from Maryland, and Jim Cooper from Tennessee. And we're hoping to be joined ultimately by Ro Khanna from California and Mike Gallagher from Tennessee. Turning to Stephen Cull, he's done this trailblazing public opinion research for years. And you'll get a taste of it today, and I hope you go deeper into the really groundbreaking work that they've done at the School of Public Policy, which is part of the program for public consultation at the University of Maryland, and also has a hat with the voice of the people that sort of takes these ideas and puts them out for public consideration. So, Stephen, we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks for coming today. At the Program for Public Consultation, our goal has been, since the 90s, to give the public a greater voice in government. We don't take any position on the issues. We're just trying to give the public a greater voice. And there are a lot of issues where it's really difficult to give the public a voice because they don't really have enough information on the issue so that they can give a meaningful response. So we've developed a method where we take people through a process called a policy-making simulation, where they're given a briefing on the issue, and then they evaluate arguments pro and con before ultimately giving their recommendation to their member of Congress. The content of the policymaking simulation is vetted with experts in Congress and elsewhere who review it to determine that the briefing is fair and balanced and accurate, and that the arguments being given are in fact the strongest arguments being presented on both sides. The goal is to put people in the shoes of the policymaker and come to their conclusions. So today we're going to look at a survey that we just recently did on reforming the way Congress is elected, looking at these options of redistricting by citizen commission, ranked choice voting, and multi-member districts. And the survey was fielded by Nielsen Scarborough. It was conducted online but with a probability-based sample, for those of you who know what that means. 2,482 registered voters went through this process, giving it a low margin of error of 2%. So we start by explaining things to people, and we explain that in Congress there's a proposal to have the shape of congressional districts set by a commission of citizens within each state. The commission of citizens would be committed to designing districts in a way that is geographically natural and compact without creating a favorable distribution for either party, be 1/3 Republicans, 1/3 Democrats, and 1/3 independents, would reflect the balance of the state according to gender, race, ethnicity, and the geographic areas of the state. And then the decisions on the shape of the districts would be made by a majority of the commission members that includes at least one member from both parties and an independent. So this is just, and again, this follows the legislation. We try to model hew as closely as possible to the actual legislation. So then we give them a pro argument. When one party has control of the redistricting process, they tend to make greater efforts to ensure that their party wins more districts, often creating weirdly shaped districts. The representatives from a particular state can be completely or almost completely from one party, though this does not reflect the real partisan balance in the state. This means that voters from the party not in control of the legislature get less representation in Congress, even though they may live in an area of the state where they are a majority. And this argument is found convincing by a very large 81%, with 43% saying they find it very convincing, and is quite bipartisan. 77% of Republicans, as well as 85% of Democrats, 78% of independents. The sample is large enough so that we can break the sample 6 ways according to the Cook rating of each district, so that we have from very red, leaning red, and so on, to very blue districts. And you can see all 6 of them if you like, but I'm just going to give you the ends from very red to very blue. And as you can see, there's virtually no difference between the very red and the very blue districts. Another pro-argument, when partisan politicians use gerrymandering to create safe districts for their party, the general election is not competitive, so the only really important election is the primary of the majority in the district. Candidates only need to appeal to the views of primary voters, tend to be more ideologically extreme, and when in Congress are less likely to find common ground with the other party. When nonpartisan commissions of citizens design districts, the districts are more likely to be competitive between the parties. Candidates are more likely to appeal to and be responsive to the whole district, and are less partisan in Congress. And this also does very well. 75% overall find it convincing with little differences. Generally, the public believes, and we've tested this quite a lot, that the public is less partisan, less polarized than Congress. There's a lot of reason to believe that as well from facts, but that is widely assumed. And there is an overarching view that the public should have considerably more influence in Congress in general. So it's not real surprising, based on a lot of other data, that they're really resonating with these arguments. They're also very frustrated, other polling shows, in the level of partisanship in Congress, so this concerns them. But now the other side. The federal government should not step in and tell the states how to design their congressional districts. People respond to that kind of thing. Doing so overrides the state legislatures that have been elected by and are accountable to the people. Giving the authority to redistrict to unelected citizen commissioners actually takes power away from the people. Well, that gets 52%, considerably less. Now you go, oh, hey, that's a majority, wasn't it? It's normal. In most cases, you have majorities finding both sides convincing. They're not saying, I agree. They're saying, there's something to that argument. There's something to that argument too. And we think this is actually a good thing. It means that they're listening, they're thinking, they're deliberating, they're hearing both sides of the issues, and then they're coming to their conclusion. But in this case, we find interestingly that there are pretty significant differences. Republicans, 2/3 of Republicans find it convincing, but only 38% of Democrats. And there's a substantial difference between the very red and the very blue districts. Second argument against, the way citizen commissions draw the lines will not necessarily lead to more competitive districts. People increasingly cluster in areas where others who are of the same party. So whatever the commission does, the districts are still likely to be dominated by one party. There will be a lot of effort with no real gain. And that doesn't do as well, just 44%. Whenever it's less than half, you're not doing very well. But a majority of Republicans, 56%, say they find it convincing. And if you look at the intensity factor here, it's fairly low. So then we ask for their final recommendation. And what we find is 2/3 say that they favor this idea of having such a citizen commission. And this includes a majority of Republicans, 53%, an overwhelming majority of Democrats at 80%, and a clear, strong majority in very red districts of 59%, as well as very blue ones at 70%. Now, we also asked them about whether the idea is acceptable to them on a 0 to 10 scale, with 0 being completely unacceptable, 10 being very acceptable, and 5 being just tolerable. So what we really want to know is who puts it below tolerable. How many people are going, I really don't want this to happen? And it's actually a fairly small number. Overall, just 19% say it's unacceptable, 29% among Republicans, 10% among Democrats, and 25% very red districts, 17%. So that the column there on the left is that's the real resistance factor, and it's not real large. All right, moving on to ranked choice voting. A current bill in Congress proposes a new way of electing members when there are more than 2 candidates. In this proposed system, voters select not only their most preferred candidate, but also their second choice, third choice, and so on. And the winners is selected in this way, all the first choice votes are counted, and if any candidates get the majority, he or she is the winner. If no candidate gets a majority based on voters' first choice, the candidate with the lowest number of votes is removed from the race. Those who gave that candidate the first choice then have their votes redirected to their second choice, and this may result in a candidate getting a majority and being declared the winner. If not, then the process is continued. So the argument in favor, in the current system, a candidate can win even without a majority of votes. In fact, a majority might actually oppose that candidate. Candidates with a small following can become a spoiler, taking votes away from a popular candidate and enabling a less popular candidate to win. Ranked choice voting would ensure that the candidate elected is, in fact, the most popular candidate. And that argument does very well, 73%, 27% very convincing, and it's very bipartisan, 2/3 of Republicans as well as 8 and 10 Democrats, no difference between the congressional districts. Second pro-argument, this system makes it possible for voters to vote for the candidate they most support, including an independent or third-party candidate, without worrying they'll be throwing away their vote. They'll know that their second preference will be counted if their first choice is not popular enough to win. Now, in general, the idea of giving independent third-party candidates a better chance is something Americans are very responsive to in quite large numbers. So it's not surprising this gets also found convincing by 75%, including 71% of Republicans, 8 and 10 Dems. Now, on the con side, our system of elections has worked for more than 2 centuries. This new method is too complicated, will cost taxpayers a lot of money, strain our vote count system, and dramatically delay the final announcement of the winners. While in principle the system could help a third party or independent candidate, it is so unlikely they could actually win that it is really not worth all the trouble. And half find that convincing, but 61% of Republicans. So you can see basically the Republicans are in a kind of more ambivalent state. The Dems are more consistent. They reject, most of them reject this argument. Very red districts a little more solid on it. Second argument, explaining this new method to voters will be very challenging. People may get confused, and this might discourage them from voting. There will be more doubts about the accuracy of the outcomes, leading to more demands for recounts. People will end up having less confidence in the final results, weakening the legitimacy of our democratic system. It does a little better, 54%, again, 61% of Dems, even half of Republicans, and again, half of Dems. Go for it. So the final recommendation, 55% in favor. However, a slight majority of Republicans do not go for it. About 2/3 of Dems go for it. And basically the same number, 56%, 55% from very blue to very red districts. And on the resistance factor, a bit higher. 29% say it's unacceptable overall, 37% of Republicans, but nowhere near majority in any category. Basically, overall 70% say that it would be at least tolerable. On multi-member districts, I'll try to be brief on this one because it's a little bit complicated. Explaining this to people is somewhat challenging. We tried a few different ways. In a state with 5 or fewer congressional districts, the state would still have the same number of House members, but they would be elected by all of the state's voters and represent the whole state. For example, a state with 5 congressional districts on the ballot there would be at least 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, as well as possible independent and third-party candidates. 5 U.S. House members would be elected by all voters in the state, and research has been done on what the likely effect would be, and basically election results would more closely mirror the partisan balance of the state, and that's sort of the essential point. And, right now in some states, people who are part of the minority party have no representation in Congress, even though they are a substantial portion of the population. Using this new system would make it more likely that people from both parties would have at least one member from their party representing their concerns, and so on. And that does very well. 73% find it convincing, 2/3 of Republicans, 80% of Democrats. Then on the con side, this idea is too complicated, requires too much from voters. They would have to get to know many more candidates than they do now. That would probably discourage some people from even trying to vote. With so many candidates to choose from, more people would be making uninformed decisions, and so on. So, basically it's too new and complicated. And about half find that a convincing argument. Again, the Republicans are, 6 and 10. In the end, 55% again favor the idea. A slight majority of Republicans oppose it, but 2/3 of Democrats favor it. And in the the very red congressional districts, basically divided, but in the very blue ones that you get a clear majority. So this is a case where there's significant difference. But what's the level of real resistance? Not real high. 27% overall say it's unacceptable. 1/3 of Republicans. 65% of Republicans say they could find it tolerable, and 20% of Dems. So that's basically the picture. Basically you have a kind of readiness, an openness. All of the arguments in favor of the propositions do quite well. The arguments against do not do as well. And so overall, the majority comes out in favor of them because they do resonate with concerns that are very strong about representation and so on, and giving the people a greater voice and moving beyond partisanship and so on. But Republicans have a fair number of reservations, and though they're not dead set against it, they do only on the commission, the Citizen Commission, do they come out with a majority in favor. The other cases, a slight majority against. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
So next up are our members to react to this, and then we would love to get a few questions in. So it's a real pleasure to start with Congressman Don Beyer, who has been a real hero on this issue. Don.
Well, good afternoon. I want to thank the folks at Fair Vote, led by Rob Ritchie, for promoting this for so many years, 25 or 26 years? A long, long time. And Steve, thanks so much. It's so encouraging to get actual public opinion information on this, because I know as Jamie and Jim and I talk to members of Congress, we get a lot more skepticism than you got. And yet it's so important to be able to restore faith in our political system. I've gone from being an automobile dealer with approval ratings of 13% to a member of Congress at about 8%. And a lot of this is because people don't feel that we work together, people don't feel that we get anything done. All these burdens of the whole notion of single-member districts with plurality voting inevitably leading to highly partisan two-party systems where it's tough to get anything done. And I think about the whole idea that ranked choice voting makes sure that everybody's vote counts. I live in the city of Alexandria, where if you're a Republican, your vote doesn't count. It's just pure and simple. And if you're a Democrat in Kansas, it probably doesn't count. And this then would turn it around and make sure that everybody's voice is heard. And I'm thrilled to see the way it's taken off. Maine, obviously, it's going to be a big deal with their primary coming up. They have to put up with Paul LePage for 2 terms with his 37% approval rating. I know Maria's going to talk about Santa Fe, Oakland, Minneapolis, St. Paul, San Francisco. Really, little by little, is taking the country by storm. And among the wonderful things is I think the projections show that when you do ranked choice voting with multi-member districts, we will have an explosion of the number of women in Congress. And that will be and because you think right now we have just a handful, I think we're 40% in the Democratic caucus and about 6% in the Republican caucus, and a number of them are leaving to run for other offices. And if you only do it one person at a time, then, frankly, the middle-aged white male is going to do okay. But if you put together a ticket of 3 or 5 or 7 people, you're far more likely to put a woman on it, to put people of color on it, to look for real balance. So we would expect a Congress that has ranked choice voting and multi-member districts to be a much more diverse Congress than the one we have right now. And when democracy is strongest, when more voices are heard, I'm fascinated that this goes back to the 1870s, because game theory was only really developed World War II, in the years right after that, John von Neumann. But this is simple game theory, that you use math and systematic thinking to find ways to maximize overall voter preferences, to take those values in a complicated world, in a world that's not zero-sum, and make sure that the people that represent us maximize the utility, the values of the people that are actually voting. And this does that in a really important way. So thank all of you for being part of this. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce, by the way, it's really cool, myself aside, that the smartest people in Congress, Jim Cooper, Jamie Raskin, are the ones that are really promoting this. So let me give you one of the smartest people in Congress, Jim Cooper. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. You're too kind. Being smart in Congress is like being the tallest building in Wichita. Doesn't say a lot. We are here today because we're here today because we want to treat voters in America better, and because we want our government to improve. I'm for virtually all the reform measures. The trouble with incumbency is most people who are already elected think that whatever bizarre system got them elected is nearly perfect. So somehow we have to get this small group of dedicated people to change the world. But as Margaret Mead said, that's the only thing that ever has. So change starts here. Now, whether it's being against gerrymandering, which everybody should be against, in both parties, but both parties love it when they're on top, or whether it's for a fairer voting system, because as we should have known since the 50s at least, a binary voting system cannot rationally order 3 or more choices. And those of us who believe in democracy should want a system that works for the people who vote, all of the people, all of the time. Now, I would not mention math myself if I wanted to sell this thing, because the public tends to be math phobic. But we need to be practical in what works. And all logic and evidence indicate this works. Now, Don and Jamie and I tried to get the Democratic caucus to adopt this for our internal elections. And that was a fool's errand, because most of our colleagues, as I say, are convinced that whatever system got them there must be great. We need to be continually trying new things so that democracy continues to improve. And when it comes to sales efforts, multi-member district, to me it's not hard to explain. What's a multi-member district? It's called a state. because every state has 2 U.S. senators. Like, get over it. You know, we've had this for 250 years. It works. And it can work to include not only people with minority viewpoints, genders. This can make democracy flourish. So we're an idea that's still ahead of its time. Y'all can help with that. We've got to spread the word, make good things happen. Thanks. And now the real brainiac, the law professor, Jamie Raskin.
Thanks so much. I'm very psyched to be working with Jim and Don Beyer on this. Don calls us the smartest people in Congress, which is definitely damning everybody with faint praise. But Rob, Cindy, fair vote, thank you guys for hanging tough. Steve, thanks for this great new poll, which will help, which shows us what I think we all know instinctively, which is that the American public wants a better way of doing our elections. And we just have too many states where the entire delegation is from one party. You think about Massachusetts, where I think they've got 10 seats in Massachusetts, maybe it's 9, but they're all Democrats. They're all great people, but 40% of the people in Massachusetts are Republicans. They got a Republican governor. You look at Utah, everybody who's from Utah is a Republican. And, you know, we got tons of Democrats in Utah, and you can just go all across the country. And that accentuates the polarization in Congress, where you have one-party delegations for entire states in the House of Representatives. So you don't have the natural bipartisanship that grows out of having people serve in the same state legislative delegation. So we got to get, you know, beyond this whole thing. One thing I think would be very useful is if we talk to the people in Maine and the people from the various jurisdictions around the country which have adopted multi-member districts with ranked choice voting to say, well, what were the methods you used to convince people? I mean, we're in the educational phase now. It's all about education. You know, we've had a series of mathematical equations in American life that have been imperfect, and we've improved upon them. I mean, we started, of course, with the 3/5 compromise, counting the slaves, the slave population as 3/5 of a citizen. Actually, it was the southern states that were wanting to count them completely because they wanted to be able to fully inflate the size of the congressional delegations from the South, and it was the northern states that said, if you're not going to allow African Americans to vote or to be represented or to run for office, why should they count at all? But they arrived at that 3/5 compromise, which has been obviously an infamous feature of our constitutional experience. And then after the Civil War, when we passed the 14th Amendment and we got equal protection, with the continuing disenfranchisement after Reconstruction ended of the African American population, you basically had the African American population being counted completely in southern states, but not being allowed to vote because of the poll taxes, the literacy test, the grandfather clauses, the Ku Klux Klan. So it was even worse at that point. Then it was like a 5/5 clause where people counted completely for the purposes of inflating the size of the delegations, but weren't allowed to vote. And so we had the civil rights movement about that. I think it was Rousseau who said that in a real democracy, where N is the number of people who live in the society, 1 over N is the amount of political power or sovereignty that each one of us should exercise. And that's expressed in the American constitutional experience with 1 person, 1 vote, which was actually a slogan that the civil rights movement that Bob Moses invented in Mississippi, 1 person, 1 vote. Well, the logical extension of 1 person, 1 vote is 40% of the votes in your state, 40% of the seats in Congress, or 40% of the seats in the state legislature. Not 40% of the votes in your state, 0% of the seats in Congress, which is what we see happening all over the country because of a combination of deliberate gerrymandering and then also the failings of the single-member district, because from the standpoint of democracy, the single-member district, as opposed to the multi-winner district, is a real disappointment. and a real failure. I mean, if you have a 55-45 split in a state and you spread it evenly across the state and you have 55% for the majority party in each district, you can end up with 100% of the delegation going to one party. That's what we're trying to get away from. So all that's a mouthful, obviously, and what we need is to hear from the people in the states where it's working, like in Maine. How are you convincing people that this is the way to go? But there's great discontent in the public about the structural failures of our politics, about gerrymandering, the formation of our congressional districts, about Citizens United, and about the deep polarization, which seems excessive even for the great value differences that exist in the country. And so these are all things that we think we have a solution to wrapped up in these proposals. So psyched to be here with everybody, and thank you, Fair Vote, for keeping it on the front burner.
So just as a thank you for all those great remarks. And just as a little teaser about what is going on in cities and states, it's great to have Maria Perez here, who is, runs our Fair Vote New Mexico project. And Santa Fe just used ranked choice voting. We also have Jennifer Pay, who has been leading our efforts in California, where San Francisco will use ranked choice voting in June in the big contested mayoral race. And these conversations are happening all over the country. I'll just say, very left and right. Utah just passed ranked choice voting as a pilot for cities, and we expect actually cities to be using it next year. And we had a bill signed in Oregon, and sort of these are moving in different places. So, but let's turn it over to Maria.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maria Perez. I'm the director of Fair Vote New Mexico, and I wanted to share with you today the experience, the RCV experience in our mayoral election in Santa Fe that just occurred last month. So we had, voters of Santa Fe passed ranked choice voting 10 years ago, and we just implemented it this year. We had a field of candidates, 5 people running for mayor in Santa Fe, and the voters, we weren't sure if ranked choice voting was going to be implemented or not, and voters were feeling very disenfranchised about that fact, that they thought their vote was not going to count, that somebody with, perhaps 30% or less of the vote was actually going to be declared the winner, and the mayor with 60 or 70% of the voters actually not wanting that person to be elected. So people were just really unhappy about the plurality method that we had up to that point. When ranked choice voting actually, it was clear that it was going to be implemented, we're going to have a ranked choice voting election. What happened after that was really remarkable. I started working with the city and with a group of community partners to educate the voters and do a lot of voter outreach to make sure people knew about the new system, what it meant, how to go about it, how it works. And we heard a lot. The people who feel not so sure about ranked choice voting will say it's too hard for the voters. We heard from the poll, right? Voters are going to be confused. It's too hard. It's gonna suppress voter turnout, et cetera. So I wanted to share with you some data that we got from an exit poll survey on election day. As far as voter turnout, the last mayoral election in 2014, we had 29% of voter turnout. And in our recent election last month, we had over 38% of voter turnout. So that's remarkable. Over 70% of people who participated in our survey said that they were very pleased with their voter experience. So people enjoyed it. People liked going there, ranking their candidates. They felt like their vote counted and that they could actually vote their conscience. And a lot of people use that language. I can just vote for who I want to vote for without having to worry about whether my vote's going to be wasted or not. So it empowered the voters to have this method. Something about voter confidence that I wanted to share with you, because I thought that this was an interesting question in the survey. More than 70% of the people who answered the survey said that they felt confident that their vote was going to count as they had intended it to count. This is in comparison to a survey that was done after the last presidential election in 2016, statewide, where only 55% of voters said that they had confidence that their vote was going to count. So I just want to let that sink in a little bit. This was a new method. Voters had never used this before. The city and the community partners, we only had under 3 months to inform voters and educate voters. So that was a concern to everybody that voters were not going to know. The software was new. There was all these reasons why people were afraid that voters were going to have no confidence in how their vote was going to count. And almost 20% more voters felt confident about the fact that their vote was going to count as they intended. So that was remarkable as well. A couple more points that I want to share with you about this election experience in Santa Fe was that the candidates really got behind this, right? As soon as implementation was a reality, I trained the candidates in their campaigns with Jen Pei and Jean Massey from Minnesota. And as soon as the candidates and the campaigns were trained, they started campaigning accordingly, right? They started canvassing on doors that perhaps had somebody else's sign, right? They had their opponent's sign on the lawn. They still went there and knocked and said, "Can I ask for your second or third choice," right? We had over 12 candidate forums, and this has never happened. Usually it's just a handful. We had over 12 candidate forums. Each and every one of them was packed, standing room only. The candidates were really, they behaved really well. They didn't have any personal attacks on their opponents. The conversation really was based on policy and substantive conversation about policy in all of these candidate forums. So overall, the experience in Santa Fe showed me that, one, voters are very smart. Voters want to be part of a strong representative democracy. Voters care about who is going to be their elected official, and they will show up if they feel like their vote is going to count. And the other thing is on the other side, right? The candidates. Candidates want to win, and if you create a system that makes it so that they have to act right in order to win, they will do that. So we had a very great experience in Santa Fe at this point. The city of Las Cruces in New Mexico is working with stakeholders there to see if we can get it passed there as well. Albuquerque's perhaps looking at it. And last point I want to make is that as a result of the Santa Fe election, the state League of Women Voters has taken a position on ranked choice voting, and they support it as a policy, as a reform at the state level. So there's much momentum, and it was great. Thank you.